The Story of Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 5, Side 2. The oldest of the courtiers constituted a council of elders called Saru, or the Great Ones, who served as an advisory cabinet to the king. Such council was in a sense superfluous, for the pharaoh, with the help of the priests, assumed divine descent, powers, and wisdom. This alliance with the gods was the secret of his prestige. Consequently, he was greeted with forms of address always flattering, sometimes astonishing, as when, in the story of Sinuhe, a good citizen hails him, "O long-living king, may the golden one," Hathor the goddess, "give life to thy nose." As became so godlike a person, the pharaoh was waited upon by a variety of aides, including generals, launderers, bleachers, guardians of the imperial wardrobe, and other men of high degree. 20 officials collaborated to take care of his toilet: barbers, who were permitted only to shave him and cut his hair, hairdressers, who adjusted the royal cowl and diadem to his head, manicurists, who cut and polished his nails, perfumers, who deodorized his body, blackened his eyelids with kohl, and reddened his cheeks and lips with rouge. One tomb inscription describes its occupant as overseer of the cosmetic box, overseer of the cosmetic pencil, sandal-bearer to the king, doing in the matter of the king's sandals to the satisfaction of his law. So pampered, he tended to degenerate, and sometimes brightened his boredom by manning the imperial barge with young women clad only in network of a large mesh. The luxury of Amenhotep III prepared for the debacle of Iknaton. 4. Morals: royal incest, the harem, marriage, the position of woman, the matriarchate in Egypt, sexual morality. The government of the pharaohs resembled that of Napoleon, even to the incest. Very often the king married his own sister, occasionally his own daughter, to preserve the purity of the royal blood. It is difficult to say whether this weakened the stock. Certainly Egypt did not think so. After several thousand years of experiment, the institution of sister marriage spread among the people, and as late as the 2nd century after Christ, 2/3 of the citizens of Arsinoe were found to be practicing the custom. The words brother and sister in Egyptian poetry have the same significance as lover and beloved among ourselves. In addition to his sisters, the pharaoh had an abundant harem, recruited not only from captive women but from the daughters of the nobles and the gifts of foreign potentates. So Amenhotep III received from a prince of Naharina his eldest daughter and 300 select maidens. Some of the nobility imitated this tiresome extravagance on a small scale, adjusting their morals to their resources. For the most part, the common people, like persons of moderate income everywhere, contented themselves with monogamy. Family life was apparently as well-ordered, as wholesome in moral tone and influence as in the highest civilizations of our time. Divorce was rare until the decadent dynasties. The husband could dismiss his wife without compensation if he detected her in adultery. If he divorced her for other reasons, he was required to turn over to her a substantial share of the family property. The fidelity of the husband, so far as we can fathom such arcana, was as painstaking as in any later culture, and the position of woman was more advanced than in most countries today. "No people, ancient or modern," said Max Muller, "has given women so high a legal status as did the inhabitants of the Nile Valley." The monuments picture them eating and drinking in public, going about their affairs in the streets unattended and unharmed, and freely engaging in industry and trade. Greek travelers, accustomed to confine their Xanthipes narrowly, were amazed at this liberty. They jibed at the henpecked husbands of Egypt, and Diodorus Siculus, perhaps with a twinkle in his eye, reported that along the Nile obedience of the husband to the wife was required in the marriage bond, a stipulation not necessary in America. Women held and bequeathed property in their own names. One of the most ancient documents in history is the 3rd Dynasty will, in which the lady Neb-Sent transmits her lands to her children. Hatshepsut and Cleopatra rose to be queens and ruled and ruined like kings. Sometimes a cynical note is heard in the literature. One ancient moralist warns his readers, "Beware of a woman from abroad who is not known in her city. Look not upon her when she comes, and know her not. She is like the vortex of deep waters, whose whirling is unfathomable. The woman whose husband is far away, she writes to thee every day. If there is no witness with her, she arises and spreads her net. Oh, deadly crime if one hearkens." But the more characteristically Egyptian tone sounds in Ptahhotep's instructions to his son. If thou art successful and hast furnished thy house, and lovest the wife of thy bosom, then fill her stomach and clothe her back. Make glad her heart during the time thou hast her, for she is a field profitable to its owner. If thou oppose her, it will mean thy ruin. And the Bulak Papyrus admonishes the child with touching wisdom. Thou shalt never forget thy mother, for she carried thee long beneath her breast as a heavy burden, and after thy months were accomplished she bore thee. 3 long years she carried thee upon her shoulder, and gave thee her breast to thy mouth. She nurtured thee, and took no offense from thy uncleanliness. And when thou didst enter school, and wast instructed in the writings, daily she stood by the master with bread and beer from the house. It is likely that this high status of woman arose from the mildly matriarchal character of Egyptian society. Not only was woman full mistress in the house, but all estates descended in the female line. Even in late times, says Petrie, the husband made over all his property and future earnings to his wife in his marriage settlement. Men married their sisters not because familiarity had bred romance, but because they wished to enjoy the family inheritance, which passed down from mother to daughter, and they did not care to see this wealth give aid and comfort to strangers. The powers of the wife underwent a slow diminution in the course of time, perhaps through contact with the patriarchal customs of the Hyksos, and through the transit of Egypt from agricultural isolation and peace to imperialism and war. Under the Ptolemies, the influence of the Greeks was so great that freedom of divorce, claimed in earlier times by the wife, became the exclusive privilege of the husband. Even then, however, the change was accepted only by the upper classes. The Egyptian commoner adhered to matriarchal ways. Possibly because of the mastery of woman over her own affairs, infanticide was rare. Diodorus thought it a peculiarity of the Egyptians that every child born to them was reared, and tells us that parents guilty of infanticide were required by law to hold the dead child in their arms for 3 days and nights. Families were large, and children swarmed in both hovels and palaces. The well-to-do were hard put to it to keep count of their offspring. Even in courtship, the woman usually took the initiative. The love poems and letters that have come down to us are generally addressed by the lady to the man. She begs for assignations, she presses her suit directly, she formally proposes marriage. "O my beautiful friend," says one letter, "my desire is to become, as thy wife, the mistress of all thy possessions." Hence modesty, as distinct from fidelity, was not prominent among the Egyptians. They spoke of sexual affairs with a directness alien to our late morality, adorned their very temples with pictures and bas-reliefs of startling anatomical candor, and supplied their dead with obscene literature to amuse them in the grave. Blood ran warm along the Nile. Girls were nubile at 10, and premarital morals were free and easy. One courtesan in Ptolemaic days was reputed to have built a pyramid with her savings. Even sodomy had its clientele. Dancing girls in the manner of Japan were accepted into the best male society as providers of entertainment and physical edification. They dressed in diaphanous robes or contented themselves with anklets, bracelets, and rings. Evidences occur of religious prostitution on a small scale. As late as the Roman occupation, the most beautiful girl among the noble families of Thebes was chosen to be consecrated to Ammon. When she was too old to satisfy the god, she received an honorable discharge, married, and moved in the highest circles. It was a civilization with different prejudices from our own. 5. Manners. Character, games, appearance, cosmetics, costume, jewelry. If we try to visualize the Egyptian character, we find it difficult to distinguish between the ethics of the literature and the actual practices of life. Very frequently noble sentiments occur. A poet, for example, counsels his countrymen, "Give bread to him who has no field, and create for thyself a good name for evermore." And some of the elders give very laudable advice to their children. A papyrus in the British Museum, known to scholars as the Wisdom of Amenemope, circa 950 B.C., prepares a student for public office with admonitions that probably influenced the author or authors of the Proverbs of Solomon. "Be not greedy for a cubit of land, and trespass not on the boundary of the widow. Plough the fields that thou mayest find thy needs, and receive thy bread from thine own threshing floor. Better is a bushel which God giveth to thee than 5,000 gained by transgression. Better is poverty in the hand of God than riches in the storehouse. And better are loaves when the heart is joyous than riches in unhappiness." Such pious literature did not prevent the normal operation of human greed. Plato described the Athenians as loving knowledge, the Egyptians as loving wealth. Perhaps he was too patriotic. In general, the Egyptians were the Americans of antiquity, enamored of size, given to gigantic engineering and majestic building, industrious and accumulative, practical even in the midst of many ultra-mundane superstitions. They were the arch-conservatives of history. The more they changed, the more they remained the same. Through 40 centuries, their artists copied the old conventions religiously. They appear to us from their monuments to have been a matter-of-fact people, not given to non-theological nonsense. They had no sentimental regard for human life and killed with the clear conscience of nature. Egyptian soldiers cut off the right hand or the phallus of a slain enemy and brought it to the proper scribe that it might be put into the record to their credit. In the later dynasties, the people, long accustomed to internal peace and to none but distant wars, lost all military habits and qualities, until at last a few Roman soldiers sufficed to master all Egypt. The accident that we know them chiefly from the remains in their tombs or the inscriptions on their temples has misled us into exaggerating their solemnity. We perceive from some of their sculptures and reliefs, and from their burlesque stories of the gods, that they had a jolly turn for humor. They played many public and private games, such as checkers and dice. They gave many modern toys to their children, like marbles, bouncing balls, 10-pins, and tops. They enjoyed wrestling contests, boxing matches, and bullfights. At feasts and recreations they were anointed by attendants, were wreathed with flowers, feted with wines, and presented with gifts. From the painting and the statuary we picture them as a physically vigorous people, muscular, broad-shouldered, thin-waisted, full-lipped, and flat-footed from going unshod. The upper classes are represented as fashionably slender, imperiously tall, with oval face, sloping forehead, regular features, a long straight nose, and magnificent eyes. Their skin was white at birth, indicating an Asiatic rather than an African origin, but rapidly darkened under the Egyptian sun. Their artists idealized them in painting the men red, the women yellow. Perhaps these colors were merely cosmetic styles. The man of the people, however, is pictured as short and squat, like the Sheikh el-Beled, formed by heavy toil and an unbalanced ration. His features are rough, his nose blunt and wide. He is intelligent but coarse. Perhaps, as in so many other instances, the people and their rulers were of different races. The rulers of Asiatic, the people of African derivation. The hair was dark, sometimes curly, but never woolly. Women bobbed their hair in the most modern mode. Men shaved lips and chin, but consoled themselves with magnificent wigs. Often, in order to wear these more comfortably, they shaved the head. Even the queen consort, for example, Iknaton's mother, Tia, cut off all her hair to wear more easily the royal wig and crown. It was a matter of rigid etiquette that the king should have the biggest wig. According to their means, they repaired the handiwork of nature with subtle cosmetic art. Faces were rouged, lips were painted, nails were colored, hair and limbs were oiled. Even in the sculptures the Egyptian women have painted eyes. Those who could afford it had 7 creams and 2 kinds of rouge put into their tombs when they died. The remains abound in toilet sets, mirrors, razors, hair curlers, hairpins, combs, cosmetic boxes, dishes, and spoons, made of wood, ivory, alabaster, or bronze, and designed in delightful and appropriate forms. Eye paint still survives in some of the tubes. The kohl that women use today for painting the eyebrows and the face is a lineal descendant of the oil used by the Egyptians. It has come down to us through the Arabs, whose word for it, al-kohl, has given us our word alcohol. Perfumes of all sorts were used on the body and the clothes, and homes were made fragrant with incense and myrrh. Their clothing ran through every gradation from primitive nudity to the gorgeous dress of empire days. Children of both sexes went about till their teens naked, except for earrings and necklaces. The girls, however, showed a beseeming modesty by wearing a string of beads around the middle. Servants and peasants limited their everyday wardrobe to a loincloth. Under the Old Kingdom, free men and women went naked to the navel and covered themselves from waist to knees with a short, tight skirt of white linen. Since shame is a child of custom rather than of nature, these simple garments contented the conscience as completely as Victorian petticoats and corsets, or the evening dress of the contemporary American male. Our virtues lie in the interpretation of the time. Even the priests in the first dynasties wore nothing but loincloths, as we see from the statue of Ranofer. When wealth increased, clothing increased. The Middle Kingdom added a second and larger skirt over the first, and the Empire added a covering for the breast, with now and then a cape. Coachmen and grooms took on formidable costumes, and ran through the streets in full livery to clear a way for the chariots of their masters. Women in the prosperous dynasties abandoned the tight skirt for a loose robe that passed over the shoulder and was joined in a clasp under the right breast. Flounces, embroideries, and 1,000 frills appeared, and fashion entered like a serpent to disturb the paradise of primitive nudity. Both sexes loved ornament and covered neck, breast, arms, wrists, and ankles with jewelry. As the nation fattened on the tribute of Asia and the commerce of the Mediterranean world, jewelry ceased to be restricted to the aristocracy and became a passion with all classes. Every scribe and merchant had his seal of silver or gold. Every man had a ring. Every woman had an ornamental chain. These chains, as we see them in the museums today, are of infinite variety, some of them 2 to 3 inches, some of them 5 feet in length, some thick and heavy, some as slight and flexible as the finest Venetian lace. About the time of the 18th dynasty, earrings became de rigueur. Everyone had to have the ears pierced for them, not only girls and women, but boys and men. Men as well as women decorated their persons with bracelets and rings, pendants, and beads of costly stone. The women of ancient Egypt could learn very little from us in the matter of cosmetics and jewelry if they were reincarnated among us today. 6. Letters. Education, schools of government, paper and ink, stages in the development of writing, forms of Egyptian writing. The priests imparted rudimentary instruction to the children of the well-to-do in schools attached to the temples, as in the Roman Catholic parishes of our age. One high priest, who was what we should term minister or secretary of education, calls himself chief of the royal stable of instruction. In the ruins of a school which was apparently part of the Ramesseum, a large number of shells has been found, still bearing the lessons of the ancient pedagogue. The teacher's function was to produce scribes for the clerical work of the state. To stimulate his pupils, he wrote eloquent essays on the advantages of education. "Give thy heart to learning, and love her like a mother," says one edifying papyrus, "for there is nothing so precious as learning." "Behold," says another, "there is no profession that is not governed. It is only the learned man who rules himself." "It is a misfortune to be a soldier," writes an early bookworm. "It is a weariness to till the earth. The only happiness is to turn the heart to books during the daytime and to read during the night." Copybooks survived from the days of the Empire, with the corrections of the masters still adorning the margins. The abundance of errors would console the modern schoolboy. The chief method of instruction was the dictation or copying of texts, which were written upon potsherds or limestone flakes. The subjects were largely commercial, for the Egyptians were the first and greatest utilitarians. But the chief topic of pedagogic discourse was virtue, and the chief problem, as ever, was discipline. "Do not spend thy time in wishing, or thou wilt come to a bad end," we read in one of the copybooks. "Let thy mouth read the book in thy hand. Take advice from those who know more than thou dost." This last is probably one of the oldest phrases in any language. Discipline was vigorous and based upon the simplest principles. "The youth has a back," says a euphemistic manuscript, "and it tends when he is beaten. For the ears of the young are placed on the back." A pupil writes to his former teacher, "Thou didst beat my back, and thy instructions went into my ear." That this animal training did not always succeed appears from a papyrus in which a teacher laments that his former pupils love books much less than beer. Nevertheless, a large number of the temple students were graduated from the hands of the priests to high schools attached to the offices of the state treasury. There, in the first known school of government, the young scribes were instructed in public administration. On graduating, they were apprenticed to officials who taught them through plenty of work. Perhaps it was a better way of securing and training public servants than our modern selection of them by popularity and subserviency, and the noise of the hustings. In this manner, Egypt and Babylonia developed more or less simultaneously the earliest school systems in history. Not till the 19th century of our era was the public instruction of the young to be so well organized again. In the higher grades, the student was allowed to use paper, one of the main items of Egyptian trade, and one of the permanent gifts of Egypt to the world. The stem of the papyrus plant was cut into strips. Other strips were placed crosswise upon these. The sheet was pressed, and paper, the very stuff and nonsense of civilization, was made. How well they made it may be judged from the fact that manuscripts written by them 5,000 years ago are still intact and legible. Sheets were combined into books by gumming the right edge of one sheet to the left edge of the next. In this way rolls were produced, which were sometimes 40 yards in length. They were seldom longer, for there were no verbose historians in Egypt. Ink, black and indestructible, was made by mixing water with soot and vegetable gums on a wooden pallet. The pen was a simple reed, fashioned at the tip into a tiny brush. With these modern instruments, the Egyptians wrote the most ancient of literatures. Their language had probably come in from Asia. The oldest specimens of it show many Semitic affinities. The earliest writing was apparently pictographic. An object was represented by drawing a picture of it. For example, the word for house, Egyptian per, was indicated by a small rectangle with an opening on one of the long sides. As some ideas were too abstract to be literally pictured, pictography passed into ideography. Certain pictures were by custom and convention used to represent not the objects pictured, but the ideas suggested by them. So the forepart of a lion meant supremacy, as in the Sphinx. A wasp meant royalty, and a tadpole stood for thousands. As a further development along this line, abstract ideas, which had at first resisted representation, were indicated by picturing objects whose names happened to resemble the spoken words that corresponded to the ideas. So the picture of a lute came to mean not only lute, but good, because the Egyptian word sound for lute, nefer, resembled the word sound for good, nofer. Queer rebus combinations grew out of these homonyms, words of like sound but different meanings. Since the verb to be was expressed in the spoken language by the sound kopiru, the scribe, being puzzled to find a picture for so intangible a conception, split the word into parts, ko, pi, ru, expressed these by picturing in succession a sieve, called in the spoken language cow, a mat, pi, and a mouth, ru. Use and wont, which sanctify so many absurdities, soon made this strange assortment of characters suggest the idea of being. In this way, the Egyptian arrived at the syllable, the syllabic sign, and the syllabary, that is, a collection of syllabic signs. And by dividing difficult words into syllables, finding homonyms for these, and drawing in combination the objects suggested by these syllabic sounds, he was able in the course of time to make the hieroglyphic signs convey almost any idea. Only one step remained, to invent letters. The sign for a house meant at first the word for house, per. Then it meant the sound, per, or pr, with any vowel in between, as a syllable in any word. Then the picture was shortened and used to represent the sound po, pa, pu, pe, or p in any word, and since vowels were never written, this was equivalent to having a character for the letter p. By a like development, the sign for a hand, Egyptian dot, came to mean do, da, etc., and finally the letter d. The sign for mouth, ro or ru, came to mean the letter r. The sign for snake, zt, zt, became the letter z. The sign for lake, she, shy, became sh. The result was an alphabet of 24 consonants, which passed the Egyptian and Phoenician trade to all quarters of the Mediterranean and came down via Greece and Rome as one of the most precious parts of our Oriental heritage. Hieroglyphics are as old as the earliest dynasties. Alphabetic characters appear first in inscriptions left by the Egyptians in the mines of the Sinai Peninsula, variously dated at 2500 and 1500 B.C. Whether wisely or not, the Egyptians never adopted a completely alphabetic writing. Like modern stenographers, they mingled pictographs, ideographs, and syllabic signs with their letters to the very end of their civilization. This has made it difficult for scholars to read Egyptian, but it is quite conceivable that such a medley of longhand and shorthand facilitated the business of writing for those Egyptians who could spare the time to learn it. Since English speech is no honorable guide to English spelling, it is probably as difficult for a contemporary lad to learn the devious ways of English orthography as it was for the Egyptian scribe to memorize by use the 500 hieroglyphs, their secondary syllabic meanings, and their tertiary alphabetic uses. In the course of time, a more rapid and sketchy form of writing was developed for manuscripts, as distinguished from the careful sacred carvings of the monuments. Since this corruption of hieroglyphic was first made by the priests and the temple scribes, it was called by the Greeks hieratic, but it soon passed into common use for public, commercial, and private documents. A still more abbreviated and careless form of this script was developed by the common people and therefore came to be known as Demotic. On the monuments, however, the Egyptian insisted on having his lordly and lovely hieroglyphic, perhaps the most picturesque form of writing ever made. 7. Literature. Texts and libraries. The Egyptian Sinbad, the story of Sinuhe, fiction, an amorous fragment, love poems, history, a literary revolution. Most of the literature that survives from ancient Egypt is written in hieratic script. Little of it remains, and we are forced to estimate it from the fragments that do it only the blind justice of chance. Perhaps time destroyed the Shakespeares of Egypt and preserved only the poets laureate. A great official of the 4th dynasty is called on his tomb Scribe of the House of Books. We cannot tell whether this primeval library was a repository of literature or only a dusty storehouse of public records and documents. The oldest extant Egyptian literature consists of the pyramid texts, pious matter engraved on the walls in 5 pyramids of the 5th and 6th dynasties. Libraries have come down to us from as far back as 2000 B.C., papyri rolled and packed in jars, labeled and ranged on shelves. In one such jar was found the oldest form of the story of Sinbad the Sailor, or as we might rather call it, Robinson Crusoe. The story of the shipwrecked sailor is a simple autobiographical fragment, full of life and feeling. "How glad is he," says this ancient mariner in a line reminiscent of Dante, "that relateth what he hath experienced when the calamity hath passed." I will relate to thee something that was experienced by me myself when I had set out for the mines of the Sovereign and had gone down to the sea in a ship of 180 feet in length and 60 feet in breadth, and therein were 120 sailors of the pick of Egypt. They scanned the sky, they scanned the earth, and their hearts were more than those of lions. They foretold a storm, or ever it came, and a tempest when as yet it was not. A storm burst while we were yet at sea. We flew before the wind, and it made a wave 8 cubits high. Then the ship perished, and of them that were in it not one survived. And I was cast unto an island by a wave of the sea, and I spent 3 days alone with mine heart as my companion. I slept under the shelter of a tree, and embraced the shade. Then I stretched forth my feet in order to find out what I could put into my mouth. I found figs and vines there, and all manner of fine leeks. There were fish there and fowl, and there was nothing that was not in it. When I had made me a fire drill, I kindled a fire and made a burnt offering for the gods. Another tale recounts the adventures of Sinuhe, a public official who flees from Egypt at the death of Amenemhet I, wanders from country to country of the Near East, and despite prosperity and honors there, suffers unbearably from lonesomeness for his native land. At last he gives up riches and makes his way through many hardships back to Egypt. "O God, whosoever thou art, that didst ordain this flight, bring me again to the house, that is the Pharaoh. Peradventure thou wilt suffer me to see the place wherein mine heart dwelleth. What is a greater matter than that my corpse should be buried in the land wherein I was born? Come to mine aid. May good befall, may God show me mercy." In the sequel we find him home again, weary and dusty with many miles of desert travel, and fearful lest the Pharaoh reprove him for his long absence from a land which, like all others, looked upon itself as the only civilized country in the world. But the Pharaoh forgives him and extends to him every cosmetic courtesy. "I was placed in the house of a king's son, in which there was noble equipment, and a bath was therein. Years were made to pass away from my body. I was shaved, and my hair was combed. A load of dirt was given over to the desert, and the filthy clothes to the sandfarers, and I was arrayed in finest linen and anointed with the best oil." Short stories are diverse and plentiful in the fragments that have come down to us of Egyptian literature. There are marvelous tales of ghosts, miracles, and other fascinating concoctions, as credible as the detective stories that satisfy modern statesmen. There are high-sounding romances of princes and princesses, kings and queens, including the oldest-known form of the tale of Cinderella, her exquisite foot, her wandering slipper, and her royal hymeneal denouement. There are fables of animals illustrating by their conduct the foibles and passions of humanity, and pointing morals sagely, a kind of premonitory plagiarism from Aesop and La Fontaine. Typical of the Egyptian mingling of natural and supernatural is the tale of Anupu and Bitiu, older and younger brothers, who live happily on their farm until Anupu's wife falls in love with Bitiu, is repulsed by him, and revenges herself by accusing him to his brother of having offered her violence. Gods and crocodiles come to Bitiu's aid against Anupu, but Bitiu, disgusted with mankind, mutilates himself to prove his innocence, retires time and light to the woods, and places his heart unreachably high on the topmost flower of a tree. The gods, pitying his loneliness, create for him a wife of such beauty that the Nile falls in love with her and steals a lock of her hair. Drifting down the stream, the lock is found by the Pharaoh, who, intoxicated by its scent, commands his henchmen to find the owner. She is found and brought to him, and he marries her. Jealous of Bitiu, he sends men to cut down the tree on which Bitiu has placed his heart. The tree is cut down, and as the flower touches the earth, Bitiyu dies. How little the taste of our ancestors differed from our own. The early literature of the Egyptians is largely religious, and the oldest Egyptian poems are the hymns of the pyramid texts. Their form is also the most ancient poetic form known to us, that parallelism of members, or repetition of the thought in different phrase, which the Hebrew poets adopted from the Egyptians and Babylonians and immortalized in the Psalms. As the Old passes into the Middle Kingdom, the literature tends to become secular and profane. We catch some glimpse of a lost body of amorous literature in a fragment preserved to us through the laziness of a Middle Kingdom scribe who did not complete his task of wiping clear an old papyrus, but left legible some 25 lines that tell of a simple shepherd's encounter with a goddess. This goddess, says the story, met with him as he wended his way to the pool, and she had stripped off her clothes and disarrayed her hair. The shepherd reports the matter cautiously. "Behold ye, when I went down to the swamp, I saw a woman therein, and she looked not like a mortal being. My hair stood on end when I saw her tresses, because her color was so bright. Never will I do what she said. Awe of her is in my body." The love songs abound in number and beauty, but as they celebrate chiefly the amours of brothers and sisters, they will shock or amuse the modern ear. One collection is called "The Beautiful Joyous Songs of Thy Sister Whom Thy Heart Loves, Who Walks in the Fields." An ostrakhan or shell, dating back to the 19th or 20th dynasty, plays a modern theme on the ancient chords of desire. "The love of my beloved leaps on the bank of the stream. A crocodile lies in the shadows. Yet I go down into the water and breast the wave. My courage is high on the stream, and the water is as land to my feet. It is her love that makes me strong. She is a book of spells to me. When I behold my beloved coming, my heart is glad. My arms are spread apart to embrace her. My heart rejoices forever, since my beloved came. When I embrace her, I am as one who is in incense land, as one who carries perfumes. When I kiss her, her lips are opened, and I am made merry without beer. Would that I were her negress slave who is in attendance on her. So should I behold the hue of all her limbs." The lines have been arbitrarily divided here. We cannot tell from the external form of the original that it is verse. The Egyptians knew that music and feeling are the twin essences of poetry. If these were present, the outward shape did not matter. Often, however, the rhythm was accentuated, as we have seen, by parallelism of members. Sometimes the poet used the device of beginning every sentence or stanza with the same word. Sometimes he played like a punster, with like sounds meaning unlike or incongruous things. It is clear from the texts that the trick of alliteration is as old as the pyramids. These simple forms were enough. With them the Egyptian poet could express almost every shade of that romantic love which Nietzsche supposed was an invention of the troubadours. The Harris Papyrus shows that such sentiments could be expressed by a woman as well as by a man. "I am thy first sister, and thou art to me as the garden which I have planted with flowers and all sweet-smelling herbs. I directed a canal into it, that thou mightst dip thy hand into it when the north wind blows cool. The beautiful place where we take a walk, when thy hand rests within mine, with thoughtful mind and joyous heart, because we walk together. It is intoxicating to me to hear thy voice, and my life depends upon hearing thee. Whenever I see thee, it is better to me than food or drink." All in all, it is astonishing how varied the fragments are. Formal letters, legal documents, historical narratives, magic formulas, laborious hymns, books of devotion, songs of love and war, romantic novelettes, moral exhortations, philosophical treatises. Everything is represented here except epic and drama, and even of these one might by stretching a point find instances. The story of Ramesses II's dashing victories, engraved patiently in verse upon brick after brick of the great pylon at Luxor, is epic at least in length and dullness. In another inscription, Ramesses IV boasts that in a play he had defended Osiris from Set, and had recalled Osiris to life. Our knowledge does not allow us to amplify this hint. Historiography in Egypt is as old as history. Even the kings of the pre-dynastic period kept historical records proudly. Official historians accompanied the pharaohs on their expeditions, never saw their defeats, and recorded or invented the details of their victories. Already the writing of history had become a cosmetic art. As far back as 2500 B.C., Egyptian scholars made lists of their kings, named the years from them, and chronicled the outstanding events of each year and reign. By the time of Thutmose III, these documents became full-fledged histories, eloquent with patriotic emotion. Egyptian philosophers of the Middle Kingdom thought both man and history old and effete, and mourned the lusty youth of their race. Kikapera-Sonbu, a savant of the reign of Senusret II, about 2150 BC, complained that all things had long since been said, and nothing remained for literature except repetition. "Would," he cried unhappily, "that I had words that are unknown, utterances and sayings in new language that hath not yet passed away, and without that which hath been said repeatedly, not an utterance that hath grown stale, what the ancestors have already said." Distance blurs for us the variety and changefulness of Egyptian literature, as it blurs the individual differences of unfamiliar peoples. Nevertheless, in the course of its long development, Egyptian letters passed through movements and moods as varied as those that have disturbed the history of European literature. As in Europe, so in Egypt the language of everyday speech diverged gradually, at last almost completely from that in which the books of the Old Kingdom had been written. For a long time authors continued to compose in the ancient tongue. Scholars acquired it in school, and students were compelled to translate the classics with the help of grammars and vocabularies, and with the occasional assistance of interlinears. In the 14th century BC, Egyptian authors rebelled against this bondage to tradition, and like Dante and Chaucer, dared to write in the language of the people. Ikhnaton's famous hymn to the sun is itself composed in the popular speech. The new literature was realistic, youthful, buoyant. It took delight in flouting the old forms and describing the new life. In time, this language also became literary and formal, refined and precise, rigid and impeccable, with conventions of word and phrase. Once again, the language of letters separated from the language of speech, and scholasticism flourished. The schools of Saite Egypt spent half their time studying and translating the classics of Ikhnaton's day. Similar transformations of the native tongue went on under the Greeks, under the Romans, under the Arabs. Another is going on today. Panta rei, all things flow, only scholars never change. 8. Science. Origins of Egyptian science, mathematics, astronomy and the calendar, anatomy and physiology, medicine, surgery, and hygiene. The scholars of Egypt were mostly priests, enjoying, far from the turmoil of life, the comfort and security of the temples, and it was these priests who, despite all their superstitions, laid the foundations of Egyptian science. According to their own legends, the sciences had been invented some 18,000 BC by Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom, during his 3,000-year-long reign on earth, and the most ancient books in each science were among the 20,000 volumes composed by this learned deity. Our knowledge does not permit us to improve substantially upon this theory of the origins of science in Egypt. At the very outset of recorded Egyptian history, we find mathematics highly developed. The design and construction of the pyramids involved a precision of measurement impossible without considerable mathematical lore. The dependence of Egyptian life upon the fluctuations of the Nile led to careful records and calculations of the rise and recession of the river. Surveyors and scribes were continually remeasuring the land whose boundaries had been obliterated by the inundation, and this measuring of the land was evidently the origin of geometry. Nearly all the ancients agreed in ascribing the invention of this science to the Egyptians. Josephus, however, thought that Abraham had brought arithmetic from Chaldea, that is, Mesopotamia, to Egypt, and it is not impossible that this and other arts came to Egypt from Ur of the Chaldees, or some other center of Western Asia. The figures used were cumbersome, 1 stroke for 1, 2 strokes for 2, 9 strokes for 9, with a new sign for 10. 2 10 signs stood for 20, 3 10 signs for 30, 9 for 90, with a new sign for 100. 2 100 signs stood for 200, 3 100 signs for 300, 9 for 900, with a new sign for 1,000. The sign for 1,000,000 was a picture of a man striking his hands above his head as if to express amazement that such a number should exist. The Egyptians fell just short of the decimal system. They had no zero, and never reached the idea of expressing all numbers with 10 digits. For example, they used 27 signs to write 999. They had fractions, but always with the numerator 1. To express 3/4, they wrote 1/2 plus 1/4. Multiplication and division tables are as old as the pyramids. The oldest mathematical treatise known is the Ames Papyrus, dating back to 2000 to 1700 BC. But this in turn refers to mathematical writings 500 years more ancient than itself. It illustrates by examples the computation of the capacity of a barn or the area of a field, and passes to algebraic equations of the first degree. Egyptian geometry measured not only the area of squares, circles, and cubes, but also the cubic content of cylinders and spheres. And it arrived at 3.16 as the value of pi. We enjoy the honor of having advanced from 3.16 to 3.1416 in 4,000 years. Of Egyptian physics and chemistry we know nothing, and almost as little of Egyptian astronomy. The stargazers of the temples seem to have conceived the earth as a rectangular box, with mountains at the corners upholding the sky. They made no note of eclipses, and were in general less advanced than their Mesopotamian contemporaries. Nevertheless, they knew enough to predict the day on which the Nile would rise, and to orient their temples toward that point on the horizon where the sun would appear on the morning of the summer solstice. Perhaps they knew more than they cared to publish among a people whose superstitions were so precious to their rulers. The priests regarded their astronomical studies as an esoteric and mysterious science, which they were reluctant to disclose to the common world. For century after century they kept track of the position and movements of the planets until their records stretched back for thousands of years. They distinguished between planets and fixed stars, noted in their catalogues stars of the fifth magnitude, practically invisible to the unaided eye, and charted what they thought were the astral influences of the heavens on the fortunes of men. From these observations they built the calendar, which was to be another of Egypt's greatest gifts to mankind. They began by dividing the year into 3 seasons of 4 months each. First, the rise, overflow, and recession of the Nile. Second, the period of cultivation. And third, the period of harvesting. To each of these months they assigned 30 days as being the most convenient approximation to the lunar month of 29.5 days. Their word for month, like ours, was derived from their symbol for the moon. At the end of the 12th month they added 5 days to bring the year into harmony with the river and the sun. As the beginning of their year they chose the day on which the Nile usually reached its height, and on which, originally, the great star Sirius, which they called Sothis, rose simultaneously with the sun. Since their calendar allowed only 365 instead of 365.25 days to a year, this heliacal rising of Sirius, that is, its appearance just before sunrise after having been invisible for a number of days, came a day later every 4 years, and in this way the Egyptian calendar diverged by 6 hours annually from the actual calendar of the sky. The Egyptians never corrected this error. Many years later, 46 B.C., the Greek astronomers of Alexandria, by direction of Julius Caesar, improved this calendar by adding an extra day every 4th year. This was the Julian calendar. Under Pope Gregory XIII, 1582, a more accurate correction was made by omitting this extra day, February 29th, in century years not divisible by 400. This is the Gregorian calendar that we use today. Our calendar is essentially the creation of the ancient Near East. Since the heliacal rising of Sirius occurred 1 day later every 4 years than the Egyptian calendar demanded, the error amounted to 365 days in 1460 years. On the completion of this Sothic cycle, as the Egyptians called it, the paper calendar and the celestial calendar again agreed. This book is continued on Cassette 6, Side 1.